We believe that 25% of the electricity can come from local solar and other local renewables. And that means that 75% is going to continue to come from remote resources. So we continue to need the transmission grid. The transmission system is the most rapidly growing component of electricity costs in California and probably around the United States.
Tell me a little bit more about how renewables might be a means of flattening those curves on the duck chart.
The duck curve is
Hey everyone, and welcome to Power Perspectives. I'm Kinsey Grant Baker, and today I want to talk about ducks. Specifically, I want to talk about the duck curve, a graphical representation of one of the biggest hurdles to renewables, intermittency. The duck curve maps total electricity demand alongside net demand, meaning that total demand minus transmission interconnected solar and wind. And the reason we call it a duck curve? Energy demand decreases midday when solar is most plentiful, then increases sharply in the evening, right around when solar generation drops. As the sun sets and remote solar stops generating, natural gas jumps in to meet increasing demand during peak demand hours at night, hence the duck shape. A neat little illustration of one of the power industry's biggest headaches, balancing supply and demand with the inevitability of clean energy. So, how are today's utility leaders flattening this duck curve? Can local solar plus storage and community microgrids solve one of energy's biggest and, frankly, most expensive head scratchers? Our guest is about to answer that very question. I am so excited to welcome Craig Lewis, founder and executive director of the Clean Coalition. Craig has 3 decades of experience in technology and policy innovation. He was the first to successfully navigate a solar project through California's Renewable Portfolio Standards solicitation process, and he's full of really wonderful insight into solving this duck curve, flattening this duck curve, and getting solar scaled fast. Craig, welcome to Power Perspectives. How are you today?
I am doing very well, Kinsey. Thank you for that kind introduction.
Absolutely. I'm really excited for our conversation today. I brought, just in case it's helpful, some visuals for anybody watching this on YouTube. We have a couple of ducks we can reference in this conversation about the duck curve. We can pick which one it looks most like. I have all of these lying around my apartment. My husband collects vintage ducks that he finds on eBay. So if we need any handy dandy visual cues, we've got it covered here on the video version for anybody listening to this. You'll have to check it out. Craig, we've got a lot to talk about today in terms of flattening this duck curve, but I think the best way to start is, if you don't mind, just telling me a little bit more about what Clean Coalition does. How did you get involved in this space? Tell me a little bit more about your work.
Sure. The Clean Coalition is a very technical nonprofit, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and a modern grid. And we're primarily focused on local renewables and other distributed energy resources because of what we're going to be talking about today, which is flattening the duck curve. And nothing can flatten the duck curve like local solar and other distributed energy resources. And I came to this out of the telecommunications industry. So I worked for some big players like Qualcomm and Ericsson. And before that, I was a commercial banker. And before that, I was an electrical engineer. And I came to form the Clean Coalition after a couple of big events. First of all was the so-called energy crisis in California, which happened in the year 2000 timeframe, where the Enrons of the world were manipulating the market and sending electricity prices through the roof. And the solutions that came into place under duress basically represented tens of billions of dollars, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars of direct transfer of wealth from the state of California to the state of Texas. And it just pissed me off like you can't imagine. And so having done a lot of policy work in the telecommunications industry, I knew, a lot about how to go figure out what was going on. And it was some really simple mistakes by California policymakers that led to this outcome where the market was really simple to manipulate by Enron and others. And so that was number one, the market manipulation that happened in the California electricity market in the year 2000 timeframe. And the second big big event that happened is my son was born in year 2001. And so I started to really think about how do I play for the future, his future, and the future of his generation, and the generation after that, and the generation, all the subsequent generations thereafter. And a lot less about playing for myself and my generation. And then the third big event was that George Bush got reelected in 2004, George Bush Jr., and that was just unbelievable to me. He was a president who, really worked to elevate the fossil fuel industry in every possible way, every possible way he could, including as vice president, right? The former chairman of one of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world. And so those three events led me to form the Clean Coalition. And before the Clean Coalition, I did transition into the renewable energy industry. As you mentioned, I was the first to navigate a renewables portfolio standard solar project in California. And so I spent a couple of years as a renewable energy project developer, mostly local solar projects.
Amazing. And I appreciate the backstory here because I think it's important to kind of, meld together the context of all of the energy realities, especially in a state like California, fifth largest economy in the world is the state of California, with this idea of looking ahead to the future. I think that's what so many of our listeners are so intently focused on right now is how do we build today for a future that we would want to pass on, for an energy future that is focused on, clean, affordable, reliable power systems. So that's what we're really gonna, spend most of this conversation today focused on. I want to make sure before we get into using, community solar, microgrids, et cetera, to flatten the duck curve that we know what the duck curve is. I tried to kind of, give the verbal explanation of a pretty visual topic in that intro, but how would you explain it in simple terms? What is this duck curve? Why is it so important for energy professionals to really understand?
Well, you did a nice job, Kinsey, of showing us a duck, and you showed us the profile of the duck for those of you who are watching the video version of this.
We've got our little duck on screen.
And so just a couple of things to point out on a duck, right? Your high point is the head. So the head of the duck is a super important point on the duck curve to keep in mind. The tail of the duck is the second highest point, and the belly of the duck is the lowest point. So if you just think of those 3 points, then the description that I'm about to give for the duck curve should make more sense. The duck curve is essentially defined by two curves. And so a lot of times I refer to it as the duck chart because the duck chart has two curves on it. The curve that is at the top is what's called the total demand curve. And that is the total electricity that is being served on the transmission from the transmission grid in the state of California. The second curve, so that total demand curve defines the top of the duck, if you will, and then the bottom of the duck is defined by what you had already mentioned, the net demand curve. And the net demand curve is the total demand curve minus the amount of transmission interconnected solar and wind energy that is being generated in California. And the duck curve basically is produced on a daily basis. In fact, it gets updated by the California Independent Systems Operator every 5 minutes, right, for the current day. And then you can go back in history and you can see every day, since they've started tracking many years ago. The bottom of the duck, if you will, the bottom of the duck profile is this net demand curve. And one thing I just want to make really clear is that both the total demand curve and the net demand curve, they both represent transmission interconnected considerations only. So the total demand is energy that's being served from the transmission grid, and the net demand is the total demand minus the solar and wind that is interconnected to the transmission grid. And I want to come back to that point in just a second. But at first, what I want to say is that the duck chart, if you take those two curves and you look at them on the same chart, it forms the profile, the side profile of a duck. So the evening peak which happens in California between 4 and 9 p.m. every single day. That is the highest energy usage that happens every single day. That is the highest point. So you start to get the shape of the head of the deck. And then because solar is the primary renewable energy resource in California. And as the sun sets in that 4 to 9 p.m. time frame, the net demand curve starts to get very close to the total demand curve. And then as both of those curves start to come down at 9 p.m. and later, it forms the beak of the duck, right? So it really does look like the profile of the head of a duck. And then the tail, same thing. The solar hasn't started cranking yet, so the total demand and the net demand curves are very close to each other. So the tail is pretty distinct as well. And then the belly of the deck is when the solar starts cranking in the middle of the day, and you just have this really, big belly that opens up between the total demand curve at the top and the net demand curve at the bottom.
Getting the real breakdown on all of these different elements, both anatomical on a duck and literal in terms of the California power systems is really helpful. I want to dig in a little bit more to a couple things that you said, but before we get into that, let's start with sort of the primary ethos that you have at the Clean Coalition. This idea that the duck curve itself represents as I mentioned, a headache, a problem, a challenge for a lot of renewables development and deployment at scale in California. But there's a possibility that renewables might also be the solution, not just the problem. The Clean Coalition has put it this way: by shifting focus to local solar and battery storage, California can reduce peak demand, lower transmission costs, decrease reliance on natural gas, and create a more resilient, sustainable, and economically sound energy system. End quote. Tell me how. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that looks like, what the theory is, and how it, we'll get to the practice part, but tell me a little bit more about how renewables might be a means of flattening those curves on the duck chart.
Sure. And the first thing I'll say is that it's local renewables and other the distributed energy resources that solve the duck curve problem. If you just stick renewable energy out on the transmission grid, you don't actually solve the duck curve because your total demand curve doesn't come down. You're still all that solar and wind is being interconnected to the transmission system, which means you still need the transmission system. That's the problem. The transmission system is the most rapidly growing component of electricity costs in California and probably around the United States. And in California, existing transmission costs range between about 3 cents and 7 cents a kilowatt hour. So they're massive. They're massive costs. And because of the way that they're metered and assessed in California, at least in the investor-owned utility service territories, ratepayers are completely blind to the exorbitant costs of the transmission grid. And by the way, that 3 to 7 cents, those are wholesale rates that I'm talking about. Those are what's referred to as the transmission access charges. And I can provide you with some really great resources for your listeners who are interested in going deeper on transmission access charges. But the reality is that 3 to 7 cents those are wholesale rates. So once those get transformed into retail rates, they're going to be, they're definitely going to be higher, right? They could be multiple times higher. And the difference between the 3 and 7, by the way, is which utility service territory we're talking about. So if you're talking about Southern California Edison, you're on the 3 cent side. If you're on the San Diego Gas and Electric side, you're on the 7 cent side, and PG&E is somewhere in the middle. So the transmission grid is exceedingly expensive. It's driving costs up faster than anything else in California, regardless of whether, when you hear people say, oh, the renewables are driving costs up, it's like, no, that is not true. It's transmission grid investments that are driving costs up. And just to be really clear, the difference between the transmission grid and the distribution grid is essentially voltage level, which is also totally correlated to the size of the lines and how high you have to get those lines off the ground. So transmission grids, it's a rule of thumb, transmission grids are where you see steel power towers. Those are, generally speaking, transmission lines. Where you see wood power poles, you're on the distribution grid. And this distinction is really important because the duck curve only deals with transmission delivered electricity. And so when you get energy on the distribution grid, then you actually are not you're avoiding exacerbating your transmission grid, which means you're bringing down the head of the duck. So the total demand curve, which is the total energy, total electricity being served by the transmission grid, as that head of the duck goes up, that is the biggest factor by far of making additional investments in the transmission grid. I just got done explaining how expensive the transmission grid is. And so anything that's going to reduce our total demand curve at the head of the duck point of the day, which is in that 4 to 9 p.m. time period, is going to reduce investment requirements in the transmission grid, which is going to save ratepayers hundreds of billions of dollars over the next couple of decades. And, hundreds of billions of dollars might sound like a lot of money, but you hear about transmission lines all the time that cost multiple billions of dollars. And when you hear those numbers, for example, um, let's say there's a $1 billion transmission line, that would be a low cost for a transmission line. The only thing that 1 billion is representing is the capital expenditure, which means the upfront investment to get that transmission line in place. What nobody's telling anybody is that transmission investment gets a guaranteed 12% return on equity from that's regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So it's out of the state of California's control. It's a FERC issue. 12% guaranteed return on equity, and with a 50-year depreciation schedule, which means that the utilities and other parties that get to invest in transmission investments, transmission infrastructure, those guys get to clip coupons at 12% for the next 50 years. And when you take into account the return on investment and the operations and maintenance costs of a transmission grid, the capital expenditure is about 10% of the total cost of transmission that ratepayers are going to actually be stuck with. The return on equity and the operation and maintenance costs associated with transmission is going to be 90% of the total cost of that transmission investment. So anytime in the future that your listeners hear somebody say, "Oh, we avoided a $1 billion transmission investment or a $10 billion transmission investment," multiply that number by 10. That's actually what ratepayers avoided, is 10 times more than the number that people are throwing out there as the capital expenditure number.
This is wonderful. We're digging into what I think is really at the core of this conversation, which is the incentive structure for a lot of the utility listeners who are tuning into this conversation. How do we change the incentive structure to make this investment in, not in transmission, in other elements in distribution and in, local renewables and DERs, things that would flatten that demand a bit? How do we make that the place where the money should go, to put it really, really, plainly.
Yeah, um, that is at the heart of getting to the heart of the problem is the first step in getting to the heart of the solution. And the heart of the solution is to properly value and compensate for the solutions that will be the most effective for ratepayers. And what I like to say, the Clean Coalition has this concept of a trifecta of economic, environmental, and resilience benefits. So optimizing for all three of those elements, economics, environmental, and resilience benefits, is really key to the Clean Coalition's mission. And the way to properly value and compensate for the solutions to optimize across the trifecta, we need to get local renewables like local solar. We need it to be properly valued and compensated. And then we need to engage other types of distributed energy resources through market mechanisms like providing price signals so that people know that they should not use electricity when they can avoid it between 4 and 9 p.m. and that they should be using electricity between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. That's when the electricity is the cleanest because we got solar cranking. And that means charge your electric vehicles during that time. That means set your dishwasher to run at that time. That means heat your water tanks if you have a hot water heat pump. set your timers so that you're heating your water between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And that's when energy is the cheapest. That's when energy is the cleanest. And that's the time of day when you have the least chance of exacerbating the transmission grid, which is what causes new investment in transmission infrastructure. So we'll have you require, if you trip it, if you increase the head of the deck, right, the highest use of electricity during the day, which is in that 4 to 9 p.m. time frame, you're going to trip. That's eventually we will hit a new high, and that will give everybody, like the utilities and the policymakers, an excuse to approve a whole bunch of new transmission to get built, and that's going to then continue to exacerbate electricity costs for people in California and across the country for that matter. I think the story in California, we're just on the leading edge of the situation, and every place else will follow the same situation.
Yeah. When we talk about investment in transmission specifically with this idea of the trifecta, I love positioning it that way, as the alternative to continued investment in transmission. I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this are thinking to themselves, we have a problem with aging transmission infrastructure in the United States that cannot meet the modern needs of a modern power system. How do you square this idea of, less investment on transmission with the many voices out there who might say that actually we need to be spending more because our transmission systems are so outdated. A huge chunk of them were built in the 60s and 70s, and we have a power system with different needs today. How do you kind of balance those two ideas?
Yeah, so the way the Clean Coalition balances those two ideas is that we believe that 25% of the electricity can come from local solar and other local renewables. And that means that 75% is going to continue to come from remote resources. So we definitely we continue to need the transmission grid. The Clean Coalition is not saying we don't need the transmission grid. We definitely do. But what we don't need to do is overinvest in the transmission grid. And just taking this one fact alone, if we had the amount of solar that is in existence out there in California today, and we moved it all to the distribution grid. So put it on rooftops, parking lots, parking structures, and there's way more siting opportunity on built environments than the amount of solar that exists in California today. But if we just assume that the amount of solar that exists today and is causing that belly of the duck, right? Because it's the net demand curve, it's the total demand minus the solar and wind. And that belly of the duck is mostly because of solar generation. If we just took that solar and put it on the distribution grid, we would reduce the head of the duck by 10%. So the peak the highest point that the head of the duck has ever reached is about 52 gigawatts in California. And had we had that solar on the distribution grid instead of the transmission grid, we would have reduced the head of the duck by 10% on that day at that moment. And that 10%, we're talking about years of load growth before we would ever have to even think about building any new transmission because of load growth. That's an example. Now, we definitely need to invest in upgrading and repairing and maintaining our transmission grid that exists, and that's true. But as I said earlier in this program, 90% of the cost of transmission is already going to those costs. It's going to maintaining and upgrading and, taking the existing transmission grid and spending money on it, right? Which has to be done. You have to maintain the grid. I'm not arguing with that, but we're already spending a tremendous amount of money doing that. 90% of all of the costs associated with transmission are going to operations and maintenance and paying the return on equity for the transmission investments when they were first made.
So let's talk a little bit now about, how this works in a practical sense. I think it's helpful to kind of get the walkthrough of how you're thinking about flattening this curve, about changing the investment structure between transmission and distribution. I would love to hear a little bit more about maybe some case studies, some practical examples. I would love to start maybe with Sierra Blanca. I understand this was a solar driven microgrid for community of residential homes. Can you walk me through some of the particulars, challenges, outcomes, key questions, learnings, etc.? What did you get out of this case study?
So the Clean Coalition facilitates a lot of solar-driven microgrids, and we do everything from come up with the original vision as to what these solar-driven microgrids, should look like and how they will perform. We do the feasibility studies. We run request for proposal processes to get a party that will actually build and potentially own and operate these solar-driven microgrids. And the Sierra Blanca community of 34 homes, the developer for that project, and by the way, that project is under construction right now. The Sierra Blanca developer came to the Clean Coalition. I got a phone call out of the blue, and the executive from the Sierra Blanca developer said, "Hey, we've got this situation in Southern California where the utility is telling us that there is absolutely no capacity on the existing grid to interconnect our Sierra Blanca community of 34 homes that we want to get started. We want to construct ASAP." And they said, "Can you design a solar driven microgrid for us? Because we've seen what the Clean Coalition has done with all of its solar microgrids for schools and counties and cities and individual corporate campuses and housing communities. And we also do a lot of work on community microgrids, which is where you take an entire grid area and provide a solar driven microgrid for an entire grid area." So anyways, Sierra Blanca calls and said the utility is telling us they can't interconnect our community, and if they are going to interconnect our community, it's going to be 5 to 10 years from now, once they can upgrade the grid. And by the way, Sierra Blanca is going to have to pay for the grid upgrade, which would be a minimum of $20 million. So you take $20 million and you divide by 34, you're at about $650,000 per home. These homes are supposed to sell for about $1.5 million. They're high-end homes in this particular community of Southern California, and they all have pools and jacuzzis, and they're 3,000 square feet of single-story homes. So these are very nice homes, and they're supposed to sell for $1.5 million, which in California, by the way, is not super expensive for a home like what I just described. But in that particular part of Southern California, it's a fairly high-end home. And so they said, we can't spend that. That would, having to spend $650,000 per home just to get electricity service would completely kill the deal. So what can the Clean Coalition do to design us a solar-driven microgrid? And so we designed a completely off-grid, solar-driven microgrid that will provide 100%, 100% of the electricity for that entire community. And it will do it with a capital expenditure of about $15 million by putting solar on all the homes. So on the rooftops of all the homes. There's no solar that is on the ground. 100% of it is on the rooftops. We get about 20 kilowatts of solar on each home. So some of them, depending on the design and orientation of the roofs, some of the homes have a little bit more than 20 kilowatts, and some of them have a little bit less. But on average, it's 20 kilowatts per home. And then we put the equivalent of 2 power walls, so about 27 kilowatt hours of energy storage at each home. So each home is its own solar microgrid. And then we connect all those homes on a private distribution grid that connects them all. So excess energy from one home is being shared with the rest of the community. And then we put 2 central batteries on it, each one at 5 megawatt hours of energy storage. So we have 10 megawatt hours across the community. And the net result is that we're spending $15 million for everything I just described. And that prepays the electricity for the next 50 years. These solar panels today, they're going to be producing for the next 50 years. We're talking about $15 million prepaying the electricity versus $20 million just to get electricity service and then pay for the electricity for the next 50 years. The net comparison is we're talking about something like $25 million, which is the $15 million to get the solar microgrid up and running, plus operations and maintenance over the next 50 years can be about another $10 million. So we're talking about $25 million of cost versus about $100 million of cost, which would be the $20 million just to get electricity service. And then you're talking about another $80 million to pay for electricity for the next 50 years. So it's 25% of the cost to do a solar-driven microgrid solution versus interconnecting to the transmission grid. And so it's just a phenomenal outcome for the community. It's a phenomenal showcase for how local renewables and other distributed energy resources can solve for 100% of the electricity need and avoid tremendous costs that would otherwise be required to do it in the traditional fashion, including relying on the transmission grid.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting example, and I love getting the breakdown of all of the costs and how they might, differ significantly from one another. When I hear about something like this, I'm curious about scalability. When you're building out these, private systems with, essentially self-contained microgrids in each home, how does something like that scale? What's the vision for scaling these smaller, microgrids and more focused systems that exist within neighborhoods or communities or, insert smaller entity here than the state of California? What's the vision for scaling something like that?
Yeah, the vision is to basically do it one property at a time. So the Sierra Blanca is a pretty unique situation in that it's a brand new community and we can design everything from the ground up. So it's a pretty easy opportunity to design the type of system that we've designed, the solar driven microgrid that we've designed for Sierra Blanca. In a traditional situation, we're talking about an existing structure or set of structures. It's very simple, Kinsey. It's about getting solar on the roof and the parking lots and the parking structures. That's solar on the built environments and attaching a battery to the solar and getting solar microgrids that provide this trifecta of economic, environmental, and resilience benefits. And every single drop of solar that we get within the distribution grid reduces the amount of energy that we need to get off the transmission grid. And every time you attach a battery to that solar, and by the way, the solar alone is reducing the head of the duck. The local solar is reducing the head of the duck, as we talked about earlier. And I hope you will share the Clean Coalition's Flattening the Duck article with your listeners because that article really tells the story, and with some beautiful visuals and whatnot. Every little bit of solar that comes into the distribution grid is reducing the amount of electricity we need to pull off the transmission grid, and that is reducing the need to invest in new transmission infrastructure, which saves ratepayers lots of money. The answer to your question of what's the approach to make all this happen is really just getting local renewables in place and local energy storage and other distributed energy resources so that we start to get a bigger percentage of our energy mix from the distribution grid as opposed to continuing to rely, for the vast majority of our electricity from the transmission grid. And as I said earlier, the Clean Coalition's our end game is that 25% of the electricity needs will be solved from local solar, other local renewables, and then that still means that 75% of the electricity is going to come from remote renewables that do require the transmission grid to deliver that energy.
All right. A lot of this really seems to circle back to this idea of this will cost less, which is a very, very appealing element of making a decision as a consumer of power. But something I've heard a lot from people on this show is that it's difficult to sometimes tell the story to the end consumer of power, specifically to a homeowner who's considering an upgrade, who doesn't really, those kinds of scenarios. Telling the story of all of this is not always easy to somebody who is not, a utility professional listening to a show called Power Perspectives. So aside from lower costs, which certainly helps tremendously, how else can you incentivize people to participate in these, microgrids or in these, less, we could call them quote unquote, less traditional ways of getting power into their homes, into their businesses? What's that look like for you? How has that experience gone for you so far of convincing people that this is the right thing to do or that this will help them in some way beyond just, your power bill will be lower, which again is a powerful force.
I'm smiling because if we're going to get this solution, we need to compel lots of people to do local solar and other distributed energy resources. So this is at the heart of making things happen and motivating people to take action is homeowners and building, commercial and industrial building owners. These are the people that, need to take the action to deploy the solutions. But we also need the policymakers to innovate policies so that we get proper valuation and compensation for everybody to deploy local solar and other distributed energy resources. Your question, Kinsey, right now, I think, is focusing on how do we get the property owners to take action, and so the way to do that is to make sure that people are educated on this trifecta of economic, environmental, and resilience benefits. Now, I happen to care about all three of those things. I can tell you from my experience, without exception, everybody cares about the economics. When the Clean Coalition talks about this unparalleled trifecta of economic, environmental, and resilience benefits, we start with economics, right? That's the first thing we mention in the trifecta because everybody cares about it. So we hit them with economics. We know that there's a good percentage of the population, but not all, that care about the environmental. So we bury that in the middle. And so people that care about environmental, they will hear that part too. And the people that don't care about it, they kind of just ignore that the environmental piece of it. And then we finish with resilience, which increasingly is important to people when you kind of communication science, right? The first thing you say and the last thing you say are what are going to come across the most clearly to people. So we start with the environmental, and so increasingly people are caring about resilience. Now, when it comes to resilience, people, you open up a paper, and you don't have to read very far before you're hearing about some disaster or another that is climate related. And those are happening on an increasing basis with increasing severity. And so people are really starting to think about, how do I make sure that my home is safe? How do I make sure that my business is going to stay operational? At least the critical loads at my business will stay operational. How do policymakers think of, how do we keep our communities safe so people aren't perishing in these disasters, when some pretty easy solutions like solar driven microgrids can solve for this, can solve for the resilience. The resilience is an element that is this kind of not widely understood piece of the solution, piece of the it's part of the trifecta. And so the Clean Coalition we've established a methodology that we call Value of Resilience 1, 2, 3. On our website, the top 10 hits will be Clean Coalition material. And the value resilience methodology normalizes how to value resilience at any type of facility. It could be a home, it could be a big industrial site, it could be a hospital, it could be a fire station, it could be just a bank or any other type of business. Um, so it doesn't matter the type of facility, and it doesn't matter where the facility is. This value of resilience 1, 2, 3, or what we call VOR 1, 2, 3, is a methodology that will allow anybody to determine what the value of resilience is to that facility, to that person, and to that facility. We need to simplify the way for people to understand that resilience has value, and I don't think that there's any confusion about that. In fact, the Clean Coalition, we talk with lots of municipalities, we talk with lots of businesses, we talk with lots of homeowners, and you can ask any one of them, is there value to resilience? In other words, is there value to at least your most critical loads staying operational when the grid goes down? And the answer is obviously yes, there's some value there, right? There's at least a little bit of value there. You think about it at your home, right? There's value to making sure your refrigerator doesn't go out and your food spoil, and that you actually have something to eat. If it's a long-term outage, right? You can keep yourself alive. The corollary question, of course, is what is the value? And in the world today, most people just go, I have no idea. And so they put a $0 value on it. That's what people do when they don't know. So we have to, help people understand what that there is value of resilience, and to quantify it. And that's what the VR 1, 2, 3 methodology does. That's really important to making sure that people take action. The other piece of it is just, making sure that people understand that there is real economic value as well. I'm happy to go into that a little bit more in terms of if you're putting solar behind your meter versus if you're interconnecting it to the distribution grid versus interconnecting it to the transmission grid. There are different value propositions for interconnecting solar and other local renewables in each of those places.
I think so much of this also is just repetition. We spend a lot of time on the Energy Central team talking about how to communicate these ideas to key stakeholders. One of those key stakeholders, of course, being average consumers whose only indication as to how they're interacting with their utility is a bill at the end of every month. And it seems like, a lot of it is just repetition of ideas, creating clear stakes like this, the value of resilience that you mentioned. It's all really, really interesting to hear how you've gone about scaling this and thinking about what comes next beyond just California, which is a theme that we have talked about a good deal in the last couple of weeks on the show. We just had an episode not too long ago about the VPPs in California, how it's pilots like what happened this summer with the virtual power plant in California might scale beyond just the state, to something that is larger and more robust. And it's really interesting to get that perspective from you here today, Craig. I have really, really enjoyed learning about all of this from you. I think if you're ready, we can get into our lightning round of the interview. So this is quick, rapid fire, just to close us out here. I would love if you could give one big misconception about transmission or microgrids. What's a misconception you would like to clear up today?
People talk a lot about demand flexibility, and they don't talk very much about supply flexibility. The duck curve or the duck chart, right? It's two curves. Those curves are all about they show demand, right? They show the total demand and they show the net demand. Those are the two curves that comprise the duck chart. But those are also the supply curves because you don't need any more energy than what's being demanded. And when you're talking about things like nuclear energy, that is a completely flat supply curve, right? You turn on a nuclear power plant and you never want to turn it off because it's really, really damaging to a nuclear plant to cycle the power at a nuclear power plant. So, nuclear power plant operators are very careful about how frequently they cycle down the power at the nuclear power plant and they get all their upgrades done all at one fell swoop. It might take a couple of weeks and then they turn it back on and it's on for the next year or so, unless there's a grid, unless it breaks down, right? But that supply curve, a flat supply curve, is not helpful to solving for the duck chart, right? It does not flatten the duck. A flat source of energy, a flat supply curve, is not helpful to the duck chart. You have to have flexible sources of supply, energy supply, in order to actually solve for the duck chart. So one of the big misconceptions that I want to dispel out there is that large baseload energy sources are the answer. They are not the answer. They're actually way more problematic than intermittent sources of electricity like solar and wind, which you can relatively easily and cost effectively put into a battery and have the energy come out of the battery when you need it, like at the head of the duct. And you can put that energy into the battery at the time when you have excess energy, like when solar's cranking, you put the energy into the battery and that flattens the duct out. But if you have any aberrations, you can pull the energy, you can play the energy in and out game with that battery to your heart's content. Flat sources of supply, energy supply, are really problematic to the grid. And by the way, if you are relying on a big chunk of your energy from flat supply sources, when those do have unplanned outages, it's hugely problematic to the grid. You have 2 gigawatts of energy that just came off because a nuclear power plant had an aberration and had to shut down for safety reasons. Filling 2 gigawatts on a moment's notice is really hard to do for a grid operator. So I want to dispel at this local level. The other thing I want to dispel is that when you give proper market signals to people, they do behave rationally. And you mentioned some of the really unfortunate vetoes that Governor Newsom made on some virtual power plant bills that were on his desk. And those virtual power plants provide signals to energy users to make sure that they're using energy when it's cheapest, cleanest, and has the least and will cause the least amount of stress on the transmission grid. So VPPs are really, really important market mechanisms that we need to get a whole lot more of, and they will help us play this game of energy Tetris, which is to take that total demand that's being needed in any given marketplace, like the state of California, and make sure that we are filling the energy supply within the total demand curve in the most efficient way, and having flexible resources that are able to come into the market through mechanisms like VPPs are extraordinarily important to solving for the energy needs in the most cost-effective manner possible.
I feel like we're gonna have some fun back and forth in the comments, Craig, from our large baseload fans out there. But I appreciate the 2 good takes, two really good ones. I've got one last question for you here in the lightning round. Do you have any recommended reading? It could be a book, a piece, a person to follow, any recommended reading for our listeners who might wanna engage more or learn more or just become more well-rounded energy professionals?
Yeah, well, I would recommend the Flattening the Deck article, which we referenced earlier today. I would also recommend several articles on the exorbitant costs of transmission and the fact that those costs today in California and most every other market around the country, those costs are hidden from ratepayers. So they have no idea what they're paying for their transmission grid, the transmission grid costs, and the fact that they are a huge and rapidly growing, the fastest growing component of retail electricity rates in certainly in California, but I think it's true largely around the country. I will provide you with those articles to share, Kinsey. People aren't going to read a few things. I would like them to read those items.
Okay, we will definitely put those in the show notes. So, in the description on YouTube or in the episode descriptions on Spotify, Apple, or wherever else you are listening. Craig, it has been such a pleasure. I have learned so much. My notebook is filled with a bunch of ideas for future episodes, other things to dig into. So I really appreciate you coming on Power Perspectives today to share all of this with me, to introduce this conversation to many people in our audience. It has been really wonderful to learn from you.
Well, it's a pleasure being here, and I thank you, Kinsey, for allowing me to talk about the Clean Coalition and our mission.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time on Power Perspectives.